In fact, you made a lot of predictions over the last months, years in fact, of where the current situation is going to end up.
I guess it's less of a prediction, it's more of seeing cycles. Actually, in my opinion, that cycle that started in 1971, we reset from a gold-backed dollar system to basically a debt-backed dollar system, where the 10-year treasury effectively replaced gold.
And now bringing it back home, we saw a lot of investment come into Pakistan.
Absolutely.
Because there was so much money out there that they're like, you know what, let's go to this market and test it out.
Overlay of Pakistani founders being comfortable in basically MENA.
And the reason is because you've got a big population in this entire region, right?
And Kareem as well, right? Kareem was Pakistani, and those founders, some of whom I backed, they're very comfortable landing in Riyadh or Cairo because they've done that, right? So they've done business and built scale there.
You say that as a society, we first need to decide where we want to head. Where is it that we want to be, let's say 5, 10, 20, 50 years from now?
Money tells you a lot about a person, right? So basically, you know, how many times, I mean, everything you do is money. You're sitting here like there's an electricity bill.
Are you looking to start up a business but are not sure which sector to focus on? Is Pakistan the right place to spend your future? And what is going to be the large global trend that everyone's going to be betting on? Check out this conversation with Faisal Aftab. He is the CEO and managing partner at Zen VC. And he's going to be talking to me about some really, really interesting long-term trends that have brought us to the point that we are in today, where we see a flood of money, limited places to invest with really, really interesting returns coming out of it. So check out this conversation right now. Faisal Aftab, how are you today?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing good.
Good. So you, Faisal, are known to make predictions. In fact, you made a lot of predictions over the last months, years in fact, of where the current situation is going to end up. Economically, financially, from a monetary policy, from a startup world situation as well. So walk me through what was your prediction and how it has played out, because it seems to have been accurate.
Sure. So I guess it's less of a prediction, it's more of seeing cycles. And so, you know, everybody assumes things are very organic, but things, when you start seeing the cycles, you see things rhyme a lot from previous cycles. So it's very simple. The whole world, in my opinion, after the global financial crisis in 2008, has gradually come on a unified interest rate band, which is led by primarily the Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Japanese Central Bank. The reason is because those are the 4 reserve currencies on the SWIFT system, which is the trade system on the banking network.
So the yen, dollar, euro, and
the pound.
Yep. So those 4 banks will be involved in setting a interest rate band.
Exactly. And there, if you look at what's been happening, effectively the whole world went insolvent in 2008 in terms of the collapse that took place. You were at Lehman back then, so I'm sure
that's very personal for you.
Watched it collapse. So same. My wife and I, we were also in New York at that time. So that actually woke me up. Prior to that, I didn't see any of these things. And then I started investigating and trying to figure out, hey, what's caused, what somebody had to know. And then you find Kyle Bass and Passport Capital. There were multiple people. The other guy I'm forgetting his name, the guy that was in The Big Short as well, the drummer with the one eye. Bill Blur, not Bill Blur, that's a comedian. Okay, so basically, I realized people were making calls of a crisis coming as early as 2005 and 6.
Right.
And they were actually, that's why it was called The Big Short, where they were shorting the market, and then the patience was being tested, and they kept on holding their positions and made 1,000x.
Right.
And so that led me to studying the financial system. And as you study the financial system, you start to realize that our current world, which actually, in my opinion, that cycle that started in 1971, when we reset from a gold-backed dollar system to basically a debt-backed dollar system, where the 10-year treasury effectively replaced gold once Nixon disconnected from the gold peg. We basically entered a total different paradigm where credit expansion was what the monetary system was dependent on. And so now what you see is in 2008, we kind of saw a culmination of that. And basically, you saw pretty much an implosion of the financial system and banks due to basically too many derivatives and bets all over the place. And that crisis moved into the sovereign. And so the sovereigns have been basically easing through something they call quantitative easing, which is actually nothing more than money printing. And they're buying their own bonds and printing money by keeping interest rates low. So that pattern that's playing out has actually put the world on roughly a 3.5 to 4 year cycle. And you can see it from the rates last time were raised from 2015 gradually. And that the raise ended in 2018, the yield curve inverted, and then literally you had a massive downturn after the repo market collapse in March 2020. Given that it was a black swan event as well, but it was long overdue. And then you had a similar pattern play out, and we're literally at that 3.5 year cycle. So what they're doing is they're basically, I call it a controlled demolition, where the only way to prop up the system is by printing, and then you're kind of gradually transferring it to the new digital system. And so that's what's playing out, and that's part of the thesis for Pakistan. Why suddenly we become important, because suddenly users and informal economies become really, really important because these aren't levered against. Maybe the sovereign's levered against the documented 300 billion, but that other 600 billion potential undocumented element can be captured through tech.
So let me break this down a little bit. What you're saying is in the 70s, right around when the oil crisis took place, there was a major event that happened where you no longer had to have gold-backed currencies, right? And that's huge because now the currency is basically in and of itself
debt. Is debt.
Is debt.
Backed by the 10-year US Treasury. That's the strongest asset.
Right. So there's no real asset. It's now all just paper, and it's of intrinsic value in and of itself.
Yes.
Right. Now that forced or that allowed for more credit to come out into the market.
Yes. So the system itself is what you refer to as depressions and contractions. That's when credit basically, when you start seeing 0% financing on furniture for 3 years, that typically is a sign that we're approaching peak credit, which we kind of did in 2021 as well, right? And that's usually when basically you see some sort of a crisis come in, and then usually there's a print after that. So not 2021, but that was closer to 2019 September, right. And then you had a massive print after that, and so that's credit expansion.
So you had credit expansion post the 70s after the gold backing ended. 80s there was still very high interest rates globally.
Yes.
Right. So how that doesn't tie for me.
Yeah. So I'll walk through it. So look, the 70s was a reset year for the US particularly. Right?
Correct.
The reason why the gold peg was taken away by Nixon was Charles de Gaulle. The French are always clever and try to act oversmart. So he actually sent back all his dollars to get redemption for physical gold.
Right.
And Nixon suspended the redemption temporarily, but that obviously never went back.
That temporary suspension is still in place.
It's technically still in place, right? Because look, in the history of mankind, every empire on this planet has only gotten there by gold. Even the American empire got there by basically saying to the allies, hey, we can't fund your currency. We can't fund you with supplies for your currency. Send us the gold. And they ended up with all the gold at the end of World War II. And then we had Bretton Woods 1. I call 1971 Bretton Woods 2. And I think the fissures that everybody's feeling right now is some sort of Bretton Woods 3. But these things take decades to play out. So I'm not going to put a bet on that.
Right. So then what happened was that the gold backing was removed. The currency in and of itself became intrinsic in value. And now you can start expanding credit in different markets.
Exactly.
So then that credit expansion led to this boom of this whole VC culture, which at the same time, technology also happened to take off.
Yeah. So I'll unpack that like on your initial question, which I didn't answer. In the 70s, the US was restoring confidence because now suddenly you had this new form of currency. So basically they had to raise rates in order to basically get everyone to buy their bonds. And they took it all the way up to 16 to 20%.
Yeah, it was very high, mid-teens.
So that's usually that's like as bad as Pakistan now, right?
And for the US to have mid-teens is very high.
And so that was the confidence restoration. Simultaneously, you had Cold War innovation in the US. a lot of that culminated and played out. And basically, by the 90s, the US was the dominant player. Actually, the sole.
So I want to pause that. Confidence, why was that confidence restoration? By raising interest rates to mid-teens, I was able to, as the US government, able to issue bonds and have a lot of buyers for it, right? Everyone wants that fixed rate of return at 16%.
Exactly. I mean, it's a pretty solid economy, like the US. I mean, they're very good at innovation. In general, most corporations on the planet were American corporations.
Right.
General Motors. I mean, I'm going back to the 70s.
Right.
General Electric.
Yep. Innovation was all America. Yeah. R&D was all America. There was no China back then. IBM was all America. So you had that. Now you're building confidence amongst the US people.
Amongst the foreign borrowers. Remember, when you're a reserve currency, foreign borrowers that are keeping dollars in their reserves technically are keeping your bonds for yield. They're not keeping physical cash dollars, right? And so therefore that demand for your bonds is the fundamental crux of the entire system.
So that is the most important thing, is that means foreign countries will then take the dollars they have, give them back to you and get a bond in its place, and that bond is paying 16%.
They're actually purchasing your bonds. So there's every 2 weeks there's an auction. Where the treasury auctions come in, and typically there's foreign buyers that are
right.
And by the way, right now what's happening, but that's part of the fissure of what's happening, is those foreign buyers are disappearing after the recent stress between Russia, China, and what's playing out.
So now foreign countries started buying US bonds because they were offering incredible returns in the mid-teens. And then that leads us into the 90s. There was a bond long-term LTCM crisis. There was a debt crisis that took place as well.
So if you look at the pattern that played out,
right?
You had long-term capital management taking all these bets.
Yep.
And then basically there was $1 trillion fund, and then there was a massive implosion.
Yep.
And then all of Wall Street had to get together and bail out LTM, right? And then that's where when I went back and I was saying I started reading and understanding the financial system. And then obviously I woke up after 2008,
right?
Realizing, hey, and by the way, all of us in our journey, a lot of the younger audience that are watching as well, you have to experience an economic crisis to truly become an investor or understand, or become an adult, basically.
So it's like, to be an entrepreneur, you have to lose money at least once.
Exactly. And so think of it this way, right? That in 2008, it moved from Wall Street to the sovereign. And so now in 2020, the crisis actually is now sitting at the sovereign, because everybody took on massive amounts of debt. And now it's turned into a currency/bond crisis, right? It's moved from the equities market to then 2008 was a combination of the equities and your real estate market. And 2020 was a combo of all three.
So I'll even come back a little bit. So in the 90s, so there were a couple of key milestones, right? So going back to 74, you've pulled back the dollar. 80s is high interest rate. There was still a flash event in 87, October, where the markets did crash, recovered a little bit, went into long-term capital management, spiraling out of control.
1990s.
93.
That was when we had the last
LTCM?
Crisis. Yeah,
LTCM was
97, 96
exactly.
Because, I mean, it's always linked to Pakistan with a...
Yes.
Pakistan always faces a crisis linked to the liquidity crunch because we borrow to meet our budget deficit, right?
Right.
And so rates go up.
And so that's what I'm going to come back and link to. So you had the LTCM crisis. Then you had 2001 take place. Completely, you can say it was unrelated. Maybe it was not unrelated. Who knows? Then you suddenly had a build-up, low interest rate environment, housing expansion, the mortgage-backed securities, and then you had an 08 crisis that actually did a reset, right? Because the reset was moving the sort of liability away from the individual to the sovereign.
Yes.
Now from 08 onwards, we had a huge bull run.
Which was basically just money being printed. You could actually correlate it. Literally 97% correlation between money supply M2 at the Fed and the S&P 500 and housing and all assets.
So you're literally printing money and spending money that you don't intrinsically have or anything that has intrinsic value, because it's it's no longer gold backed, and B, it's all literally debt. Now
you're borrowing from the future, basically, right?
You're borrowing from the future.
The millennials and Gen Zers are like looking at pictures of houses. Because it just you can't keep up with the debasement.
And so now you've been printing all this money. There's a lot of liquidity in the market. Everything, there's inflation, there's pricing has gone up, and interest rates were low. Then you come into 2020 and you see COVID
Yes.
pull back a little bit, but then you print even more money.
You print they so let's unpack that a bit. In 2008, it took them, I think, something like 6 to 9 months to get 700 billion through Congress just to
Yeah.
get approval. So this is how desensitized everybody's become.
Yeah.
In 2020, it took them 1 hour
Yeah.
to announce that they're going to print 7 trillion.
Yeah.
And literally, I think the world shut down on, was it 21st or 20th UTC time on a Sunday? I remember
Yeah.
it was 6 p.m. in Pakistan. And the next morning, just the Fed alone printed something like 7 trillion, 6 or 7 trillion. Then ECB did the same, and then all pretty much central banks around the world. So that was probably the largest amount of debt, because again, printing is debt. Debt issuance, I think probably in humanity's at least recorded history.
And that's 7 trillion that was printed in 2020 versus 700 billion
So it's
in
a 10x.
2008. And so, I mean, people forget that, right? People say the 2008 crisis was the big crisis and you printed so much money, but it was 1/10 of what was printed in COVID. And so now
Desensitization. over
it's
the years.
desensitization. So
But
now
people don't realize how much even a trillion is. If you stack those dollar bills physically, these are all digits.
Yeah.
It's like basically all, it's like Manhattan, like times 10x. There's a visual capitalist website. You should go on there and see
Right.
what a trillion looks like printed.
Wow. So now you've got all this money floating around. All of it, right? Everyone is liquid. And I see that liquidity was tied to a lot of these alternative investments as well. Your crypto,
VC,
blockchain, startups, right? So the whole VC.
And housing, pretty much everything, equities.
Pretty much
That's what
everything.
spawned Nvidia, Apple, like trillionaires. That's actually hyperinflation technically getting
Right.
concentrated up there. It's all, I always run back and laugh. I'd hear from my parents' generation that in the 80s, $100,000 was a lot of money. And then a millionaire was a big deal, right? By the 2008 portion, a millionaire was pretty common in at least Manhattan.
Yeah.
But it was based on purchasing power loss more than anything else. If you remember Austin Powers,
Yeah.
Dr. Evil
One-
gets pulled out from cryogenic.
Yeah.
He's holding the word hostage for, I think, like, I don't know, for $1 million.
Yeah.
Somebody explains to him, he's like, dude, $1 million is not a lot of money.
Yeah.
So it's a similar type of thing where trillions
Yeah.
have been channeled. And I
Yeah.
think what's happening is to avert inflation actually showing up in food. When it does show up in food, they start raising rates.
Right.
It's being channeled into equities and into housing and the bigger assets, right?
Right.
But then that creates that social gap, that disparity
Yeah.
of the haves and the have-nots.
And so now you've got all of this debt floating around. There's all this liquidity post even 2021, right? So 2020, 2021, we saw the markets rise. We saw everything go up. And now bringing it back home, we saw a lot of investment come into Pakistan
Absolutely.
because there was so much money out there that they're like, you know what, let's go to this market and test it out. The minute the boat got rocked, all of that investment dried up.
Absolutely.
Right. So
it's-
what I'm trying
it's
to understand.
liquidity. It's literally like how do I put it? It's like if you imagine a spider's web
Right.
and the central bank is at the center.
Right.
Not just Pakistan, it's like global reserve currency.
Right.
And basically, when you raise rates, you're
Right.
sucking all the dollars and liquidity out of the system of the
Right.
world. And that basically then shuts think payable and receivables and the whole cycle, like from across the world, right? And then remember, the world wasn't as much onto debt as it is today. It was
Right.
not that common for people to just take on debt in the 60s, 50s, 70s. Today, it's a foregone conclusion. People
Yeah.
don't even think about buying a house without debt. That was not the case if you went back maybe 30, 40 years ago. This is more of an 80s phenomenon. Credit cards came around in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right. So it's people take it for granted that borrowing is just normal.
Yeah.
It's good. I mean, I'm not completely going against that. Personally, don't borrow. But for business, you do need credit.
Right.
In different formats, right? So it's not all bad. But
So then if credit is good and there's all this money, what happened to the startup scene in Pakistan? Because I can understand money drying up makes it harder to invest, obviously. But there's also some fundamental challenges that even when there is less money, look, when there's less money, you will still save and put money away somewhere, right? You might put this much money away because you have less of it. But what do? You fly to safety.
yes,
Right. And
that's why everybody's dollar.
exactly
Perceived safety. I call it perceived safety.
Perceived safety, right? For some reason, this market of 250 plus million people, right, could be one of the largest consumer markets in the world. For some reason, it is unable to bring liquidity when things are tough.
Yep.
So that means this is not a safe market. It is a frontier market for that reason.
We keep going in and out. So sometimes we'll go to EM, emerging market, and
yes,
then
and then we come back to. So what is the fundamental problem for that, and how do you get out of it?
So look, that component comes down to, it'll go down to the, like, your politics is just an outcome of the general population, right? So when you look at Pakistan in general, one of the first things I noticed when I moved back is you're always starry-eyed when you're living abroad and you coming back to Pakistan. And as an adult, I realized that we're a very divided nation across biradris and tribes and interests that are not necessarily national interests,
right?
But they end up being like institutional or individual or family or clan interests,
right?
So I think that division nobody else can fix apart from us, right? I mean, it's not as if countries come and go, and so do nations, right?
Right.
So that's something I think we have to look inward. And one of the things people have to do in Pakistan is stop relying on looking for some sort of a savior, and everybody can start on their own and start having a larger impact on the society, right? But I mean, generally, I don't like to talk about religion, but even religion is a very simple message. It's like, make sure take care of your neighbor, family, people around you.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just going back to the ethos. But, that structural issue exists because of that. We're just a divided nation, and we can't come to consensus for what direction we want to take.
So, but who brings that? But again,
it's a collective. Institutions, politicians, bureaucracy. Everybody.
Leave all of those aside, right? For a second, if you say that as a society, we first need to decide where we want to head.
Yeah.
Where is it that we want to be, let's say 5, 10, 20, 50 years from now? People need to be herded, right? And given direction, because most people don't know what they really want, right? And so any successful entity, any successful company, any successful religion always has that one person up top that guides the community, and that person is from the community and serves as a servant, serves that community without a pomp and show of all of that, right? The question then arises is that how do you find that person, and how does that person rise to the occasion to be able to take this community forward and remind them of what it is that they need?
So look, in my opinion, those people arise organically, not necessarily the people that we think that were, let's say, icons that everybody's built. Because we're also, remember, this is a very unique time. I think it's probably one of the most important times in history, since World War II.
Right.
I personally believe we're in World War III. It's less kinetic.
Right.
It's more financial and economic in nature. And you'll keep seeing skirmishes like you're seeing.
Right.
But what is the underlying fissure for that? The underlying fissure, let's go back to the previous cycle. The previous cycle was actually pretty long. It was 1914 and 1945. So World War I and World War II were actually the disruption of the British Empire.
Correct.
And both were linked to that. And it was the rise of the American Empire, or you can say the end of the pound reserve currency and the start of the dollar reserve currency. So at that time, your princely states, your monarchies, your feudals were being disrupted by new technological innovation, which was the industrialists. And in that entire cycle from 1914 to 1945, at the end of that period, the industrialists had become the barons, and a lot of the agricultural workforce had moved into factories. So now let's fast forward to today. This disruption started sometime in, let's say, 2001, I'll take as a benchmark, similar to 1914. And that's really when the dot-com bubble peaked, and then really Amazon and these companies actually started emerging after that, right? After the bubble.
Right.
So from that, if you look at it, and World War III has started. So let's say that, from that period till now, this technological transition has started where technology is disrupting the industrialists.
Right.
They call it like the fourth industrial revolution, but to me, it's very simple. Technology is disrupting all the old systems. That typically, when you have these type of changes, and then what's happened? At that time, you had the rise of the US to counter the UK. Now you have rise of China to counter the US. So these things are going to take decades to play out. I'm not implying that the US is going to lose the
Right.
mantle. But there's definitely fissures that you can see in the form of TikTok getting banned, or you're seeing in the form of NVIDIA. The US government effectively has stopped NVIDIA from sending those chips to China because the battle now is for the digital empire and for payments. And then the most important thing, like gold in 1945 and then de-link of gold in 71, money itself is changing because now we're in the exchange of value disruption on the internet. And so that element is kicking in where, okay, we have alternate settlement systems. The most dominant one was SWIFT, which was technically in control of the US and allies. Now you have alternate settlement systems. And so that disruption is pretty profound in terms of what's playing out. So I want to kind of lay the context here because in order to actually see Pakistan, I think that part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to actually back a lot of people that I feel are smart individuals that wouldn't have gotten a chance in the traditional banking system, where you needed to put up collateral, which then inherently has a disadvantage, right? Because if you have collateral, you can go get a loan and build a business. And a lot of the smarter people were being left out. And so a lot of people that I've backed in my portfolio tend to come from the middle or lower middle income background. So they've actually seen the issues of Pakistan.
Right.
And hopefully these, at least 5-6 of these founders become, exit big.
Right.
Similar to what Mudassar has done, right? And if you see, so I think that's where leaders will naturally emerge because the amount of quantum of money that's going to be made. I know people think startups are like this little tiny thing happening on the side. But really, if you look at the S&P 500, let's go back to like 20 years ago, you barely had any tech companies. I think only Microsoft was in the top 10,
that's true.
right? Today, if you look at it, the whole S&P is Magnificent Seven. It's all tech. So we're already in the digital empire.
Right.
Now, Pakistan's pieces are going to emerge. And that's, in my opinion, going to be in Fintech. And that's why I was talking about all this stuff with money, because this is unlike anything what anybody's seen before. The combination of Fintech and AI really changes. Money is everything. Money is all pretty much what all empires have. They become empires by controlling money. And so when this layer becomes digital, you have to take the whole structure simultaneously, the underlying nodes of the internet, who owns those. And we can get into that in more detail.
So but the biggest challenge, when you keep saying digital, right, what it keeps telling me is that first and foremost, if you want to be part of the future, let's say 40, 50 years of global domination, right? And that domination is coming through, let's say, technology.
Yes.
Right. And then obviously you layer in AI. All of this is entirely dependent on one thing, connectivity. If you have no connectivity or the infrastructure of connectivity, there is no way you can be a part of this future.
Hands down.
Period.
We're lagging in
and so
connectivity.
We used to be ahead. At one point, we were actually ahead at connectivity. In fact, we were testing WiMAX even before it was present in the US,
Absolutely.
right? And we were lagging on 3G, 4G. The US got it out first. But right now, what we're seeing in terms of connectivity are significant issues. And based on your thesis, where let's say you have to be, technology is the play, which we're seeing how it plays out. Currency, your exchanges, the way currency is handled, documented, whether it is crypto, whether it is traditional.
KYC, ML, CFT.
The KYC process, all of that stuff is all related to connectivity.
Yes.
Until we solve connectivity, there's actually no point even playing this game. You're at a disadvantage.
No, so again, as I said, I mean, many countries and nations have come and gone, right? So we have to basically get our stuff together on this stuff, right? So it's very simple. Disruption doesn't ask, if you give the opportunity, it'll take the nation away.
Right.
And so when I say that, for example, you had titans like Verizon and AT&T, the bulk of their revenue was coming from long distance. Back in the day, it used to cost a lot. I think many of your audience may not understand that when you picked up a phone to call someone.
You used to book a call.
It's like you book a call, exactly, the switches, right?
Yeah.
So, and then WhatsApp came about, or Zoom, and has basically wiped those revenues out, right?
Yeah.
And so many intermediary companies that existed, that were multi-billion-dollar companies, are gone. That's how disruption works.
Yeah.
ABC, CBS, NBC were cocky about Netflix and YouTube being startups. Today, their eyeballs are gone.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing with CNN.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that disruption is something that the incumbents tend not to see. And so Pakistan has two choices. Either we harness this, basically change and leverage it to our advantage, similar to what India has done or China has done or the US has done. I think the European Union is actually in trouble. They didn't harness this too well. In terms of at least technology, like being one of the dominant technology platforms or offering big tech. But from Pakistan's perspective, we do have a significant chunk of people, and the demographics are correct if we can harness them correctly. I know everybody talks about the youth and harnessing them, but really it doesn't matter, because education, to me, with the revolution coming in AI, becomes somewhat irrelevant. That was an industrial age training that we had to do in these, I call them institutions that would break you down to work in a factory. Really took the creativeness away. It's not normal for a kid to sit from like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on a chair. That's conditioning. But the industrialists needed that back then, right? So now you have a bunch of population that's actually not been indoctrinated into that system. They're actually very innovative if you actually think how people survive here. You go to a mechanic here or go to
Gujranwala. It's all Jugaad.
It's Jugaad, right? Jugaad is being creative.
Yes.
So once AI kicks into place and you suddenly start having speech to text, you don't need to read. You can listen to things in audio.
Yeah.
It's the same as like WhatsApp adoption, right?
Yeah.
Like your gardener will send you voice notes.
Yes.
Or they've learned basically Roman Urdu.
Yeah.
Broken up or whatever. So necessity breeds adoption. And I think that's going to change fundamentally Pakistan. Now, the question is, are we going to basically remain as a nation state, or are we going to get amalgamated into a regional economic zone? Because the stronger economies or the middle powers in the region, especially once this AI innovation race gets more and more aggressive, this is a mind-blowing disruption. I think people are completely underestimating what's about to happen in the next 6 years. Things are going to change. Like it's like picking someone up from 2008 and dropping them off in 2024. That same level of change is about to take place in a very short period of time.
So I want to add to that, right? So there's a hypothesis that I have. You will no longer have a passport of a physical boundary. Your passport will be digital. So you're either a resident of the Apple country or the Amazon country.
GDPs. Look at that. After the US and China, I think then you start having NVIDIA,
companies,
Apple,
exactly,
Microsoft.
Right? So now my passport is digital. And so within that digital passport, my AI, my technology, my content, my education, everything is within that. And then there'll be some interoperability between that. And it's interesting that you mentioned economic zones rather than boundaries of countries.
But everyone's going to have to go on an alliance to survive.
So the question then arises that if my physical presence in a location is no longer relevant, because unless I'm in manufacturing, in which case it's different, right?
I mean, that's all going to stick around there'll be the hybrid world for a long time, right?
Of course there will be. But if let's say boundaries start to disappear, right? And you truly start thinking of being boundaryless, where you can operate and do anything from anywhere, right? When it comes to creating income for yourself. Right? What does that world look like? And what is that outcome? What does that outcome require us to do right now?
So there's not much we can do. I mean, we could have spent more time thinking about this stuff 10, 15 years ago. I think our problem is we keep changing. We start off on a 5-year plan, the proverbial one that everybody says.
We start off on a new 5-year plan every year.
And then every time there's a flip in government or regime, you basically just reset to zero, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, we never finish. And that's the division within that we have to go back and look at that. But let's go back to how the world is changing. So they stopped referring to the world as the first world, second world, and third world about 10 years back almost.
Right.
And they started referring to the world as in each location, high income demographic, middle income demographic, and lower income demographic.
Right.
Now, what you're going to see is basically as, labor is no longer tied to physical presence.
Yeah.
Very, very different environment we're in, right? So I think the cream of the crop will, let's say, get pulled into more developed economies around us. So let's say the Gulf economies, as they spend money to grow, they're going to pull some of the best finance people. CFOs are always in shortage, right?
Yeah.
Finance people, some of the best tech people, and so they may physically, get the ability to, even in Europe, where there's a demographic shift in the US and the developed world, generally, you have a shortage of younger people.
Yeah.
So the smartest people will actually go, which is not, to me, is not a brain drain. Like in India's case, it's always an asset because they end up bringing some level of knowledge or expertise back or if nothing else, they become an inspiration for the younger
Or they
generation.
send remittances.
And remittances, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one element. But then you have another layer of people that are creative and smart, and most of the programmers tend to be self-taught. They're
Yeah.
not necessarily coming out of like
Correct.
institutions.
Even the creatives that we have, most of them are self-taught. They learn the
Exactly.
tool and I just have a creative background.
And for me, that's the blessing in disguise, that educational system was so weak
Yeah.
that basically people had to, and the economy, that people had to figure out jugaad. So they're
Yeah.
resilient. And this, by the way, this was the same way India was. We always benchmark them. We don't realize we're at a pretty significant lag effect to India,
Right.
and which was far less before. We just, started lagging. So you're going to see different types of, some people will be doing well working for some startup in Silicon Valley,
Right.
out of Karachi. And then you'll see another part of society, and it may not necessarily be the people that you think. You could see people from the lower income demographic end up actually making higher quantums of money. And let's say Gen 3, Gen 4 run family business, where let's say children don't have the work ethic or understanding of how to build the business or continue the business, you could see a declining trend there, right? So very similar to, let's say, the princely states and then the Nawab.
Yeah.
50 years later, you see is like, like living in, wherever, right? Not necessarily the palace.
Yeah.
So those type of trends are going to play out. I think they're going to play out a lot more rapid than people are realizing. Again, the velocity with which tech moves is a lot faster. I mean, mankind, if you look at in history, we've been constantly moving faster and faster.
Right.
Whether it's the invention of the wheel,
Yep.
and harnessing like basically animals to ride, airplanes. So this disruption to me is very different. And then coming back to what you were saying on connectivity, I want to set the context because these are like actually very deep things we have to think about versus the present and now, right? So in order to actually succeed, you have to visualize what things would be 10 years from now and then work backwards to come up with a plan. So look, if we don't fix our connectivity and control our nodes, Starlink will come from the top and only American apps will be offered on that, right? Or the Chinese will drop something via satellite and only Chinese apps will work. That's the battle between the US and China.
So when you talk about Starlink and the equivalent, let's say, connectivity in China, right? So that means that it no longer is dependent on the country as long as the citizens have access to a device that can connect to whether it is the US connector or the provider of data or the China version of it, right? They are now connected into that universe.
Exactly. So change the individuals in a population that somehow we thought was a disadvantage.
Yes.
Change those 250 million into 250 million users.
250 million users are sitting here that can connect to either network.
Yes.
Right. So now let me map this out. So there are two choices we need to make. Which network do we want to be a part of? Right? Because fundamentally, that's the ultimate choice.
And that's where I'm talking about the zones, right?
Yeah.
The world is being, let's unpack like how the world is structured, right? Just like you have the Eurozone.
Yep.
Now, me speculatively, I think we went from the SCO zone to the Middle East, North Africa, and Pakistan zone.
Right.
In terms of, and you can see the network being built in that direction.
Right.
When I say network, I'm talking about the digital network, right? Like there's a natural overlay of Pakistani founders being comfortable in basically MENA.
And the reason is because you've got a big population in this entire region, right?
And Kareem as well, right? Kareem was Pakistani, and those founders, some of whom I backed, they're very comfortable landing in Riyadh or Cairo because they've done that, right? So they've done business and scaled there.
So you can actually back on these founders. They're comfortable in moving around these markets. The markets have similar behavior. They are very trust dependent, very people dependent, very community dependent.
And even the nuances, if there are, they've already done that with big capital, with Kareem and or other tech.
So these entrepreneurs from this region are the right players for this global game. Now the question is, where do you get the alignment? Now, from my end, so there's two books that I read that I really that really made me think a lot. One is Super Intelligence by Nick Bostrom. It's an older book, but it talks about sort of the evolution of intelligence and how there will be connectivity and neural networks and AI will be the dominant thing, right?
Which is what's happening. These LLMs and the clusters with NVIDIA.
So now you're seeing that play out.
We're like literally like living in that world right now.
Where you're seeing the intelligence be bifurcated. Someone's got more and someone's got a slightly different version of it. Then if you layer this book with a book called AI Superpower by Kai-Fu Lee, who is I think the Google head in China, he talks about the difference between the US versus China in AI. China has what Pakistan has, the user base, right? So they have
1.4 billion now.
Their government-backed AI initiatives, government-backed tech initiatives. So they have 1.4 billion users of digital content and data. And those large language models they've developed have access to all of that data, right? So their
and I could think of it as a closed system, right?
They have a closed system, right?
Unlike an open, like Android type open source system.
So they have far more data to build their models on, and so their models
domestically. But that's where the US has an advantage because we're speaking in English,
exactly,
right? Not Mandarin.
So the model is different. Now the advantage the US has is it has more research, more R&D, and the language is spoken globally. So while their data
and the data, right? So look at what we've been using. We've been using Facebook, Google, Microsoft, pretty much American tech. All that is data points. And I mean, I think I was reading the other day that I think Sam Altman or somebody said that pretty much all the data sets that humanity's generated that was available has been kind of used up by AI right now, like in where the stage it's at. And so more and more data sets are needed. And that's really where like your financial transaction data, because that tells you pretty much everything about everyone, right?
So then if I look at those two models, right? So China has got a lot more data points and users. The US has a lot more knowledge, R&D, and it also has more people who are better equipped and knowledgeable about this because they've done research, education. The best educational institutions in the US are 300 years old.
There and China. Because China basically can produce like 1,000 engineers and just literally lock them in a room and get things done. So it's we have to give them their credit also, right?
Fair enough.
I consider the two almost at technological symmetry with now trade-based, it's more tariff-based advantages that are playing out. Because if NVIDIA wasn't stopped, China was pretty much at parity with the US until the release of basically OpenAI or ChatGPT into the general public. And that really, I remember talking to some of the big tech guys in China, and they were actually like, look, we're now worried because we have a lag. And then NVIDIA... So
OpenAI, and when OpenAI launched ChatGPT, that created a lag for China?
Yes, because suddenly you've got the general public going in around the world. It's adoption, right? They didn't have a product like... I mean, it's just a chat layer, chatbot layer, but the point is...
But like you just got data input, right? So you've now started feeding that model with more data by giving people access. And so now, whereas Chinese was a closed system with a lot of data points, now there's more data points coming in onto these platforms in the West. So then the question then arises is if I had to place a bet, and I am the sovereign in Pakistan, right? And I have to place a bet. I mean, ultimately, you're either Apple or you're Android. You can't say that my tablet is an Android tablet, but my car has got Apple Play, and then you got to choose, right? Because otherwise, trying to be
that middle ground part is very tough now.
Because especially when it comes to technology and everything's tech.
We're in that final stage now, right?
Yes.
Of like this.
So where do we bet? If we had to pick a side, we're forced to choose a side. Which side do we bet on?
So economically, we've not played our cards too well. I mean strategically, our military supply lines are all on the Chinese side. Our exports are all on the developed market side, right? And so we really didn't create much leverage for ourselves. We gave other people leverage on both sides. So we're
using Chinese inputs to sell outputs to the West.
Pretty much. And also, look, you do need a military, right? Without a military, you can't defend just like you need...
Do you need a military? You just said that you're entering and seeing World War III that's taking place without even the...
Yeah, so that's why we haven't been like, Ukraine. Otherwise, we're a transit rock country like Ukraine, right? What's the real instability in Pakistan? It's really Iran, which is producing energy, and the consumption sitting on the other side, which is China and India. And then the powers that be, the existing superpower, not wanting... Because Iran is selling its energy in euros. It has a right to do that. But really, Pakistan is that ground where, that's where the land connectivity. The US is very dominant in waters. And that's why China wanted to connect with Iran via Pakistan, where they can look for alternate routes now. And India was actually a very strong partner with Iran, but the US offered them a comprehensive strategic partnership, which... In my opinion, they're going to pump India with their capital to the third largest economy over the next 5-6 years.
So now we know India is going to get more cash, which means India is going to create a bunch of billionaires, lots of startups, make
It's
money.
like China 2.0.
It's a China 2.0.
Not like to that level, because they have China. China was a lot easier to manage.
Right.
India still has a lot of division, but
Right.
look, when capital is available,
Right.
there's enough people out of 1.5. Indians are actually pretty smart when you go all over the world, right?
So
they'll
and
pull it
you've
off.
got top tech companies run by Indians, so they've got
Absolutely.
that advantage, right? Okay, so we know India is going to go up. We know Iran is always going to be a net energy producer, supplying the world. So we also know that. Can't change our neighbors. Now we also know that the US and China are at parity, but China sees a disadvantage because of the Nvidia and the chip situation.
They're 3 years behind.
And if you start seeing bans like TikTok ban come into effect, the Huawei type ban that we saw in earlier years as
That
well.
was all for data, right?
That was all
It
for
was
data.
5G because it was a battle for data.
Correct.
So imagine like those things happening 7 years ago, when people think that OpenAI just suddenly, I actually think that there's a lag. Governments, the respective empires are releasing technology with a bit of a lag in terms of what they already have.
So if I look at it with this play out, and then I'm going to add in a cultural layer, right? The cultural layer is that here in this market, in fact, in this region, either it is your native language or it is the English language, because we've been influenced. I mean, we were a colony for a few hundred years. So we have been influenced by European and Western culture.
Yeah.
In fact, that entire part of the world has been influenced by European and Western
culture. The whole issue
culture.
in Pakistan is a colonial hangover.
Is a colonial hangover. Now, because you have a colonial hangover, you really don't have a true nationalistic identity, because we're a little confused. We still think English is the better thing, and we look at English as elite.
But that's where AI really changes that game, right?
Correct. But the question that really arises here is, if AI changes that game, and I have two AI options, AI USA and AI China, which is basically what it's boiling down to, which one am I going to end up inclining towards?
It's probably the US AI. Unless the Chinese pull out a product that's like very user-friendly for... let's look at the fundamental shift.
So you're saying, I want to pause that thought before
I'm saying the empires offer currency, offer their language, right?
So that's what you're saying.
So
language
now,
is the determining factor.
But what's happened? So, everybody wants to go put their children into coding, right? What is the new language of coding after AI? It's English. You're basically
That's
text
exactly what I was coming
basically,
to. So the language, it is actually the language.
Yes.
It is the spoken language of English that is going to determine where your bias lies.
And let's see, what could happen in Pakistan, as we've seen, for example, that the larger demographic, the lower income demographic, went for TikTok.
Right.
Whereas the more English speaking in a higher demographic went for Instagram and Facebook, right?
But the reason was simple, because TikTok is a lot easier to use to create content.
So I'm saying don't write off China. We don't know what they'll throw out from a user interface perspective. But as of now, there is a lag because of the processing power. Because NVIDIA can't sell.
You don't think that the language and the connection to language and culture is going to influence this decision?
No, because I don't think there's a correlation between being intelligent and English. It's just because in our current world, that in my opinion, most of that ended in 2020, and we're in a new unknown system. That's this battle for what that system is going to be, right? We don't know what that is, but what I do know is that there's a bunch of intelligent people that can't speak English, that you use the word jugaad, and you go to Gurjanwala and see how people are reverse engineering stuff.
Fantastic.
Right? So those people suddenly can use tools like AI to actually communicate and have things translated instantaneously, take text to speech, which they can hear in Urdu, even if it's in English or Japanese. This changes a lot of things. So basically there's no inherent advantage. The US, again, all I can say is the US is in an advantage because most of the world is anglicized in terms of like pretty much whether you look at finance or whether you look at like most of the curriculum today and official languages whether we can meet. I mean, if I meet someone from Russia, I speak to them in English, not Urdu and Russian, right? But looks like it could be them dominating, but it's up for grabs, because if you can now communicate with anyone instantaneously, it's not just speech to text. I mean, eventually this stuff is going to evolve to a level where you speak and immediately converts it to Russian or to Portuguese. So the collaboration and the communication and sharing of knowledge and ideas.
So it becomes language agnostic.
And all sorts of disruptions start taking place. Right?
So you'll probably have a tech that listens and it translates and it speaks and it translates. And we're not that far off from this tech without any lag or latency. And so the question then is that if language is no longer a barrier, then how do you choose which side to align with?
Again, like I'm saying, that this is a disruption that I think even in the US at this point, the debate is that what is this going to end up doing? This is just what we're living in right now in the form of nation states. This is not how humanities existed always, right? So we just assume that this present version of history, that is our present version, is what everything is going to be like 1,000 years from now, right?
Yeah.
And so this is potentially evolution. This is potentially devolution. We're devolving. So I have no idea, but what I do know is that this is a very profound change in what's about to happen.
Right.
And so you can't can't bet on the status quo. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that the powers in the world are going to change to that level, but I think from the weaker countries could see themselves get amalgamated into other regional countries, in not necessarily like as in a union, but in the form of a marketplace where regulation is singular, or the tech platforms are regional tech platforms, at least in the fintech space. That's what I'm seeing. The larger big social media, those type of platforms already in play.
Right.
Think of the impact social media had on our society and how little we effectively lost state monopoly on propaganda, which pretty much all countries have had to maintain status quo. And so that's part of the fissures, right? You can't shut down social media. Once technology is out of the bag, it's impossible. But what AI is going to do is, in my opinion, going to be much more profound than that.
But then this also brings a second point in, right? So if connectivity was the first one, that is the foundation. The second one is the exchange of value.
Which is what I was referring to, because most of my portfolio today is geared for that disruption, which is happening simultaneously. Remember, the money tells you a lot about a person, right? So basically, how many times, everything you do is money. You're sitting here like there's an electricity bill, right? So when you can see people's purchasing habits, that's a lot of data, right? And so that eventually is going to feed into in my speculative opinion, I think we're going to a global social scoring system, very similar to what China has, which is a closed system. But gradually we'll all go to that. And then regulation like FATF, which is basically pushing for traceability and cashless systems, and OECD common reporting standards are basically kind of indicating we're heading in that direction, where basically the nation state effectively is defined. Your data is defined by your tax residency, which is 180 days or more in different jurisdictions, and then that data can be sent, which is your financial data. So pretty profound changes.
So then in that case, the exchange of value is important, because if I can be connected, if language is no longer a barrier, and if I can use these AI tools to be further efficient and create something new and unique, then I'm able to create some new value and transfer that value to someone else in return for some sort of compensation.
Absolutely.
Now that means that we need to be open to the transfer of that compensation using some sort of technology or platform that will allow transfers to take place from any part of the world to any individual.
Those are what a lot of these cryptocurrencies are. I don't think most of them are going to survive. Like even when you had the video over IP disruption, you had multiple. If you recall, there was QuickTime, there was Windows Media Player. You had 10 different ones competing, and then DivX won the standard, right? In this scenario, because it's money, the layers are very different. You have store of value assets, which let's build the chain of money, right? So you've got gold, then you've got bonds, currency, then you've got basically stocks, bonds, mortgages, or real estate paper. Then you keep building derivatives, all sorts of stuff on top of that pyramid, right? So all of that at each stage is getting disrupted. So Bitcoin is digital gold. It's just emulating as a settlement asset of last resort in that scenario. Then you've got Ethereum and Solana competing for basically a platform on which basically tokenization will happen, which ties into climate, carbon trading, which ties into real estate tokens,
Right.
Stocks, eventually potentially coming on Ethereum or Solana. Think of them as like competing platforms, right? 90% is Ethereum right now, 10% penetration Solana.
Right.
So while people are thinking this is like some goofy thing happening, first time in the history of tech, actually, you can invest in the infrastructure layer. Historically, you couldn't. You couldn't invest in DivX unless you were a VC that somehow basically found that team early on.
Yeah.
The general public is able to actually go into it. Well, not in Pakistan.
Yeah.
But lots of interesting stuff is happening.
So the ability to transfer and store value, if we don't give that to an entire population of 250 million people, they can never be real consumers or real creators, right? And if you're not going to enable them to be a consumer or a creator, you've actually really detrimentally affected that society.
So look, so let's give credit where credit is due to Pakistan, right? So we have Rast. That's a component of what this exchange value disruption is. So these are just nodes getting created. UPI in India. You've got, look at Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, kind of being the master node, and then all these other nodes. FedNow in the US, the European Central Bank has a similar one. Bank of Japan, Bank of Japan as well. Eventually, you will have every country create a central bank digital currency, which will be that blockchain technology. And then the rest, the speculative side of it, which is basically, I mean, that I can understand, just like any Pakistani tax resident is not allowed to invest in Google or Amazon. That's a choice we've made. But I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's something that, the government has to figure out, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of how structurally we build stuff, we're pretty much poised in a positive way that the new system, which is going to be an evolution of the Swift, or maybe Swift just upgrading to blockchain, is going to be available. And then in that, KYC, AML, CFT is all embedded. And then you have to envision a cashless society in Pakistan, which in my opinion should happen gradually. Like in the urban, already you notice most people prefer paying with Jazz Cash, Easy Pesa.
Yeah.
Your bottom demographic does not really have much to hide.
Yeah.
It's just about a 5 to 10% base of the top that is wants to stay in cash because
wealth declaration, right? And taxes.
You just have to look at India, that when they demonetize and bring less money into circulation, or whatever action they take, you leapfrog in documentation because ultimately people have to get by, right?
Yeah.
And so they will adopt the whatever technology you throw at them.
So you're
I think
saying
that element is going to be there.
And you're saying that we're well positioned for that?
Yeah, because you have Rast. I mean, sure, Rast needs to be managed more effectively, and they have to come up with a mechanism on how to make it.
What is Rast?
Rast is your basically like the UPI in India is your central basically system at the central bank that allows all the payments to basically circulate.
Settle and clear,
right? So rather than having like a third party, which I forget what it's called, the OneLink, they do one component of it that's more still, I call them analog payments, less digital. But Rast eventually should allow you to.
So if there's Rast in place, then being able to transfer funds in and out of the country is also easy?
Yeah. So think of that as a node on which all the other fintechs and payment platforms are connected.
Right.
Eventually, some are connected right now.
Right.
But some in my portfolio are connected. Others are in application for connectivity. So eventually, all that stuff is going to be, it's a visual footprint of your economy, right?
But right now, it's very hard to move money in and out of this country easily.
Yeah, it's because of capital controls. Look, that's what OECD Common Reporting Standards kicks in. Eventually, they're saying, hey, nation state, whoever's the tax resident in Pakistan, if they have assets abroad, we will report that data to you. Actually, if you go, we became signatory in 2016 to that accord,
right.
And you're on the gray list primarily if you're not. FATF is somewhat, even though it's supposed to not be, but it's somewhat linked to that. So that's regulation is pushing us in that direction. If you look at the IMF, they actually basically this time around actually had one of the line items that bring crypto into the mainstream. Yeah. We have roughly $10 billion of Pakistani money sitting in crypto exchanges. So
$10 billion.
Roughly. That's what the estimates
I heard a stat the other day that we have over 100 and something crypto millionaires in Pakistan.
Easily. But why would you not want to do that, right? Because that effectively benefits your economy.
Yeah.
If everybody's poor here, then basically you're not going to. So rather than just focusing on things to tax, let's tax the retail sector.
Yeah.
Let's tax the entire big market, 50% of the economy that we're not taxing, just because they might be vote bank. That's pretty, in my opinion, we have to address that, right? But let's not go after like a new industry. Let it emerge, let it document our economy for us.
Yeah.
And everything in crypto, by the way, crypto is like the epitome of documentation. There's no privacy coins are been banned by most exchanges, by most sovereign governments like the US. So really, it's like basically a bank account.
It's actually the perfect KYC too. You can identify the end user, maybe not as a person.
I mean, there are people that are using it for
yes,
illicit transactions, but I mean, so they're using cash as well. So you ban cash.
Correct.
Like eventually, once people are on it, every transaction is recorded and the history of it.
Right.
And so, in my opinion, we should be okay with it. I do get why they're worried about it. There'll be a massive flight of capital. Yep. I've proposed in previous, when they had these forums where they wanted advice, I'd proposed doing a gated exchange, simply allow people to buy and sell and they can't withdraw crypto from the exchange, right? So then you'll allow banks to link to that exchange. But anyways, that's besides the point. My main focus of this podcast today in our discussion is that we have to really recognize that the exchange of value disruption, what's happening in the fintech space, what's happening with AI, these are not independent events. These are all going to tie in. And then the superpowers or the digital empires of the world are going to again price you in their particular dominant tech.
You'll have a CPM for your country or your people, equivalent.
Exactly.
Right?
That's
and
it.
So then in this...
Just like we're priced in dollars, I mean, like we're pegged to the dollar. Not really pegged, but our reserve, 96%, I think, is in dollars.
So then in that case, now that we have this picture clear, right? This is where it's headed. This is where we have ended up today. I am an entrepreneur and I'm a startup. I want to be a startup founder and I want to solve one of the world's problems while I sit physically here, right? What is the problem I should think of solving?
I think it's the use cases on top of the big LLMs. Like, for example, Llama is, unlike with OpenAI, Llama is free, which is Facebook. So you can go and build an application. Remember the revolution that took place when iOS and Android came about, and then everybody was building applications, and people were building gaming studios, making like 10 million and then exiting and retiring. You've got that same level of opportunity. Obviously, you have to have the skill set to create something. But
to solve a human problem, but use AI to solve that human problem.
Find a solution AI. There's still so many problems that are unsolved in Pakistan. So my job as an investor is not to come up with the solutions for the problems, is to actually bet on the people, because
that are coming up with the solutions.
My personal belief is people are smarter than I am. I'm just an investor. And so my IP is simply to be able to identify the person that once they tell me what their idea is their ability to execute that idea. That's what really...
How do you judge? So you're saying that then, okay, so you're saying use an LLM to solve a problem. That's the next...
I mean, we can't afford to create our own LLM in Pakistan.
That's true.
Even the country can't, right?
So that's the next play. Use an existing LLM and solve the problem. So now we've cleared that. Then the person who's going to find a solution using an LLM to solve a problem, you identify based on their idea and their ability to execute.
Not yet. I mean, meaning that I will in the future.
You will.
Yeah.
But in all the companies that you've invested in today, when you invest in people, how do you ascertain... The idea is easy to ascertain because you can just do the math ballpark and come up with the actual market size.
And there's a timing element too.
And there's a timing element. But how do you ascertain someone has the ability to execute? If someone in their mid-20s showed up, startup founder, wants to execute, has never executed, what is it that you look for and how do you ensure?
So in platform plays, it's slightly different because you have to see some level of execution ability. So typically, we're not going to back someone straight out of high school or college. It's going to be somebody that's been at another big tech or not big tech or regional tech, and has scaled to some extent, right? And then basically when you hear the idea, you're assessing the motions in their head that typically people that are smart at executing are thinking 5 years out, and they've kind of done the mental. You're just like, they say when you are running a marathon, if you actually visualize the marathon ahead of time, you kind of polish your actual execution. So it's by asking questions, right? And so I don't just ask like, oh, what will you do? I'll try to ask like 5-year questions, and I'll ask a lot of questions in terms of where do you see the company in 5 years? Like, what is your vision in 5 years? It's really a vision at the end of the day, right? I mean, we're taking a vision of something that as an idea, and then you're using basic matter to bring that together to fruition. So as long as that person has thought that well, typically you back them and they've demonstrated some ability. But in the new paradigm, what's interesting is you could have like 16-year-old, 13-year-olds that are just prodigies and have figured out how to leverage these LLMs to produce a use case that could, let's say, solve a problem that none of us even paid attention to, right? Like, let's say the electricity leakages on our grid. So those are something very different. That's similar to like trying to bet on like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg.
I would leave the prodigy aside. The thing that I'm struggling with is that if I'm going to look at someone and try to understand their thinking around execution, I also know that I can actually go to AI and tell me how to build my thinking around execution. So then how do you bet on talent going forward?
It becomes a lot tougher. I think for VC, like as a venture capitalist, I'm spending about 6 to 8 hours basically understanding what the pace of change. This is not easy. And so in my industry, I feel like everybody's still looking at the last 30 years, not realizing that it's all happening simultaneously. Pakistan, the tech disruption is not going to be like, oh, Silicon Valley had like a e-commerce platform in like the 2000s. So we're going to have the next 10 years. No, it's all happening. For us, it happened simultaneously, like fintech, e-commerce, like mobility. Everything was like in a very quick succession. So it's kind of a similar type of a scenario with AI. You have to kind of educate yourself. Even in crypto, I've been in this domain, like I consider myself an expert. I can tell you there's so many chains out there that it becomes tough to keep up to date on this stuff, right? And so layer 1, layer 2 is like all sorts of other use cases. Now the AI use cases coming on crypto that are giving you tokens as rewards to actually test out certain elements, right?
So this is so hard to keep track of, right? And eventually you said that you're betting on people. After all of this technology aside,
I believe VCs themselves are going to be facing a disruption. They've been, the bubble created a lot of VCs. This happened to hedge funds as well.
Because there's so much free money.
So you're gonna. But the question is that if you don't have something unique, so I build my IP on more qualitative skill sets. I could have chosen the quantitative, which would be series B and C. I think there'll be a massive disruption there. Because that's something AI can do. Qualitative is identifying people, assessing people. So in that, yes, I mean, I have to educate myself because it's not like we're born with every thesis. I'm studying AI as we speak and evolving my thesis and consuming tons of content, reading tons and tons of stuff. I was watching this just the other day, the Stanford talk of the Eric Schmidt, the Google co-founder and former CEO. So, and by the way, everybody's giving their speculative opinion, right? So from that, we have to extrapolate and try to figure out where things are going.
So you're going to find an entrepreneur who offers something unique, is got something more on the qualitative side because the quantitative can be disrupted with AI. And even with like the execution thought process, you can actually lift it from an AI model and regurgitate it, right? To me, it sounds like you're basically betting on the soul of an individual and how that individual's soul is wired.
What is a podcast? It was a thought that you had. And then you manifested it and then you use different, you purchased, somebody put this material together, matter. So it's mind over matter.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to.
But the mind assessment, I feel that will not change. I don't think that can change because the way you assess another's soul, right? Sometimes it's gut that tells you, and gut is usually a combination of experience.
Is extremely underestimated. In fact, I remember one of my first ventures that I was doing, one of my partners in that said, "Do you go on a gut feeling?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?" And then actually, if you look at Jeff Bezos, they asked him recently. You can pull that clip up. He said that what percentage of your stuff? You said a long time ago that you go on your gut feeling, and then you use data.
To back it up.
Feeling. So they said, today, after what Amazon's become, what's your response? And he still said, I would go on my gut feeling and use data to back it up. That's kind of what I do also, right? So it was a gut feeling that in the next cycle after that crisis that emerges, Pakistan will actually move towards digitization. And that compelled me to move back because out of the next 11, this was the only country where I had some level of street advantage. Not really to that level. I had to go through my battle scars to actually earn some street cred here. But it's, it's worse than me landing in Nigeria. I would have lost my shirt, right?
Right. That's true.
I've only lost half my shirt in Pakistan so far.
So you still have to go for gut. And the only way to develop your gut is through multiple experiences. You have to actually go and like literally have failed, have succeeded, have done everything in between. And
I think you have to lose money, which I did plenty of times.
Yeah.
Like in my 30s, all the savings I'd done in New York, I took bets on different, pretty bad things.
Yeah.
And that taught me how to become a better investor, right?
Right.
So you have to manage money and play with it a little bit.
So if there was a sector, it sounds like fintech is your sector that you're...
For now. This is
but one of your best investments, coincidentally, has not been in fintech. It's been in retail and beauty.
You talk about Lam.
Yeah. Co-natural, I think.
No, co-natural is not mine, but it's one of my favorite products.
Okay.
We were talking about that. Is an amazing fund.
Yeah, we were talking about that.
Yeah. So, it's been in terms of quantums of returns when they come, I think it'll be the fintechs that'll really, if there's going to be a unicorn out of Pakistan, by the way, I don't think there's going to be 5,000 unicorns coming out of Pakistan. That's like...
How many do you think there'll be?
I think just on a sheer debasement of currency, like I'm talking the dollar purchasing power loss, you'll probably in about 10 years or so, you'll have probably like 10 to 20 unicorns.
So a country of 250 million people is a country of only 10 to 20 unicorns.
But those are going to turn into like $5-10 billion companies, right? So let's like extrapolate. Let's say 10 years from now, you have like a $50 to $100 billion market in our tech platforms, because it's like Pac-Man eating up your regular economy, right? And so they become what Adamji or Habib Bank was at partition in the newly formed Pakistan. It's what a lot of these tech companies are in the cliche digital Pakistan.
Right.
And so they're going to end up becoming pretty important in my opinion. But you just have to wait and have patience in this game. So I think fintech, some of the companies like Habal, NeaPay, Adilfi, which is a credit scoring engine, which the Saudi Central Bank now has actually gone into a strategic partnership with. That's how good the algorithm is. Postex, again, regional. These are
why logistics?
That's a key problem in countries like Pakistan. It's not Postex is a fintech that uses logistics as an embedded play to solve the problem of basically the working capital issues that, let's say, a traditional logistics company was sitting on the float. Even now, that when they supposedly settled it in 3 days, they try to fundamentally they think in that manner.
So they're basically like a distributor that gives you money.
And you also collateralize. So when you pick up the package or you pick up the goods, you collateralize it and give a percentage of that to
payment forward.
And they've scaled really well because of that. That need was there, but you can't just lend. Like I'm not really comfortable with B2C lending in Pakistan. So most of the fintechs that I've invested in are either B2B lending or B2B2C lending.
What about microfinance?
Microfinance is interesting, but I think that a lot of those problems have already been solved, right? Like you've got basically Tamir or Easy Pesa, Jazz Cash, and so I like the plays where you've got like either B2C payments, where in the form of what NiaPay is doing, it's a two-sided platform, so it's targeting that element, and also like small businesses, not small businesses as in like retail, like companies like yours or mine that have like a payroll, but it's not like at the level of like, let's say, an Engro. And so a lot of them need solutions as well. And then Habal is doing the supply chain financing and settlement layer, which is massive. That's like a huge TAM in the local market.
What about digital entertainment, like gaming, esports?
I think that's amazing. Gaming. Like what some of my peers, like in VCs, they've actually revolving games is phenomenal. What's that investment? It just comes down to everyone's expertise, right? So because I'm more fixated on the exchange of value disruption, what's happening in AI, technically Adilfi is one of the strongest AIs in Pakistan. It's a credit scoring engine, right?
Okay.
So it's algorithms using data and then taking decisions and then having very low NPLs, almost 0%, lending to bank consumers.
Interesting.
So that's just my expertise. Or traditional e-commerce stuff, but that's all kind of like a thing of the past now, right? Now you have to look to the future.
Do you think there's still opportunity for an e-commerce player in Pakistan? Because it seems like the two dominant ones, Foodpanda and Daraz, dominate about 70% of all e-commerce online, right?
So like Crave Mart, for example, right? They're capturing, and you may see a partnership with a bigger tech, right? So market is massive. When it comes to e-commerce, you can have multiple players. and we'll see what emerges. What I'm doing is like in my e-commerce, what I did was I started going after components, whether it was LAM, whether it's like Bag Gallery, whether it's BookMe or CraveMart, where you have the highest lifetime value
Right.
of a customer once you spend the customer acquisition cost. So, because typically when larger platforms move in, they want to build these components with higher margins, higher
Right.
lifetime value, and that's where the acquisitions take place.
Interesting. Where do you see the biggest roadblock?
The biggest roadblock is, I think, our structural issues. When I
Right.
say like a capital inflow in Pakistan, nobody's going to invest if you're going to lose everything in currency devaluation, right?
Right.
So why invest in dollars and just, I've factored in about a 10 to 12% devaluation per year going forward. I mean, obviously some years will be more, some years will be static, but I have to be fair to my LPs and
So
highlight
that
that in
means
IRRs. Shaving off, let's say, okay, so some companies have grown like 1,000%. So we come in at such an early stage that we expect
yeah,
to get at least a 4 to 6x
yeah,
in 10 years. But I'll have to shave off
10% every year.
10%, 12%. So what would have been, let's say, an 8x or 7x could be a 5x.
So you're
So
saying
that
that.
hurts capital coming to Pakistan.
So then capital coming to Pakistan has to look at a couple of things. First is the deval. Let's say that's 10%. Then there's inflation. Let's say that's another 10%.
Yeah.
That's 20%. Then your cost of
So
capital.
inflation, basically the currency devaluation is pricing in that inflation element.
You
right?
think
So
it's pricing it in, or would you keep
to
it
some
separate?
extent, because we can, if you're sending dollars in,
Right.
it's cheaper anyway. It's offsetting it, right?
So you would just take one of the two.
Ideally, you don't want any of these things, right?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you the issue that we're going to face, and probably a lot of my industry is not going to like this since we like to hype stuff.
Yeah.
Look, the reality is very simple. I think the companies that have been bet on in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of capital was sloshed around.
Yep.
The winners are going to emerge from all of our portfolios. Literally, every VC fund has a powerhouse in their portfolio.
Right.
In 5 to 10 years, these will be the bigger tech companies in Pakistan.
Right.
Things have changed going forward. First and foremost, a lot of people that came in 2021 and previous cycles as well, these are just their 10% allocation of opportunistic investments in their fund, not a mandate for Pakistan. So in 2021, they felt Pakistan could be the next India.
Right.
And so, or mini India, or like the next Malaysia. And so they took a bet, but these are $1 billion funds, right? Like GFC or even MSA Novo. I've co-invested with these guys, or Tiger. So when they allocated a small amount, it really moved the needle for us significantly, right? So it was almost like a huge spike like you see in any bubble. But the reality now is that, and they do that for outsized returns. Hey, you take a bet early in this type of market, this could turn into a massive unicorn. You have to do the math on that, right? You have to really factor in a 10% position, and with dilution, if you exit at 3% and there's a unicorn, then you make money, right?
Yeah.
Holding 3% with dilution and defense. So in the same way, a lot of those VCs can now make those returns in AI bets pretty much in the US or pretty much anywhere in the world. So I don't think we're going to see that type of capital coming anytime soon. What you are going to see is a lot of regional strategic acquisitions, or basically strategic expansions where Pakistani companies expanding to the Gulf.
You do expect to see that.
5 of my companies have raised and expanded to the GCC.
But okay, fine, on the startup side, but not traditional large scale.
No, I think some of the some of these other guys are thinking of moving plants and stuff to
other countries,
to Saudi, especially because of that GCC tariff and stuff. But look, brick and mortar, in my opinion, we have 2 economies right now, right? Obviously not putting everyone in the same boat, but if you look at the S&P 500, you see a huge separation from your regular companies and the technology companies, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, if you actually look at in Pakistan, you've got brick and mortar traditional companies just kind of going sideways, right? I'm not saying there's no demand for that; they'll come back, but in a long haul, it's a diminishing return in those businesses. Whereas tech is parabolic and it goes into a bubble and just comes back and retraces to the mean. But if you look at the long-term trend, it's an upward trend,
right?
And so, what happens when it goes like this, everybody starts investing in tech. When it comes down, they think it's going to zero, but it's an adoption that's taking place. So naturally, the growth in tech, because every user that goes online has an impact in some business offline.
True.
And so there's massive growth happening there. And so obviously, just being early there,
Yeah.
you're benefiting from it. That may not be the case 10 years from now,
Yep.
15 years from now.
So then coming back to the roadblocks, the first and biggest roadblock is the return that the investors are expecting. And those
Because
returns...
of the AI paradigm, you're seeing those opportunistic funds would rather go into AI bets in the US or in even other markets.
Right. So they'd rather take a technology play rather than a regional play.
Or like frontier market, right?
Or a
The
frontier
whole
market
idea is to
play.
get into these markets early to get those returns.
And the reason for that is the roadblock of the currency devaluation as being the biggest
that's one. But I mean, now, really, we have to come up with some amazing innovation. That's not to say that there's going to be lots of climate-based investments and things coming in eventually. Those are just funds and allocations. But a lot of that's linked to DFIs like IFC and BII. That's very different than actual like smart VC money. Or I don't want to call it smart because VC behaves like retail at times, but like institutional money coming in, private capital. That's really the game changer because that has linkages to other private capital and then eventually big tech acquisitions. And so
any other roadblocks that you see?
Just governance. That's just,
governance is the big one.
We get our stuff together. This is a gold mine, in my opinion. But look, for me, Pakistan, the bullish case for Pakistan is very simple, right? If earlier we started the conversation on predictions, right? So I'd said that about July of 2023, when the sentiment was really, in fact, I got like a lot of negative feedback for that. But I put that out there because I want people to start thinking long term.
Yeah.
And so if you go to my Twitter, it's actually pinned there. I said, when we look back in 24 months, the bottom of sentiment and the market in Pakistan, which is kind of the economy, was between Jan to June of 2023. And we're like in 2024, let's say another 6 months or so, you'll start to see the trend go upwards.
Yep.
And then the other thing I had said is that for VC, you'll start to see liquidity start to come back in Q3 of 2024, which is where we are today. And that's just linked to, and I'd said Q2 of 2024. And then obviously based on how much the Fed raised, then I changed it. I think initially I'd said 2020 Q2, and then I changed it to Q4. That's also playing out because the Fed is going to start cutting. But again, I'm warning that first of all, the cycle is going to be short-lived. I don't think it's going to go too long into. It's not going to be like a 2-3 year run. I think it probably peaks out sometime in 2025. And so really, companies that can raise now will survive.
Like now.
Some of them have already raised, right?
Yeah.
They've been raising quietly, and you've got maybe like a small window of 6 to 9 months to raise. Yeah. And if you can't raise, you're going to be a zombie company, and then you better figure out profitability.
So Jan 2026, what's your prediction?
I think the real, and again, this is speculative, nobody knows, but I think the real recession in the US shows up in 2026, unless they do a massive print, which is what my gut is they're going to print big time.
Dependent on the election outcome or either president coming in will do it?
I don't look at the election outcomes. To me, it's like, the outcome is kind of determined, right? Yeah. So I focus more on the Federal Reserve. They have to print, otherwise the system is debt-based. If you don't expand credit, the whole system comes down. Yeah. So they'll expand credit. They'll find a mechanism here and there. It might be a credit event, whether it's fiscal. I think it's a combination of now we were in a monetary dominance environment where you're printing money only from the central bank. Now it's a combo of fiscal and monetary. So you print fiscally and do stimulus there and here. I think you're looking at anywhere from 4 to 7 trillion of a print again in 2025 to where the markets prop up. If the recession comes early, they're going to print more than that now. If it doesn't, which I think it's probably 2 years away, it's usually probably in 2026 sometime. Well, whenever that shows up in late 2026, early 2027, that's when the next print would happen. Remember, whenever they cut rates, there's always a downward dip simultaneously. And then it takes 12, 13 months for things to come back up. Yeah. So
interesting.
Brief cycle.
It's a very brief cycle.
Well, the world has changed also, right? Yeah. We're in a pretty serious...
So are we going to be moving away from the the dips?
Yeah, we're now at the 3.5-year cycle.
We're at the 3.5-year dip. And we've bottomed out.
Bottom was November 2022, right? And so markets, if you look at the US markets, and we're just like we front-run the crisis in the US, we also start recovery. So if you're looking at Pakistan, the only issue we're facing is because of that stagflation and structural issue. Right. Most of the inflows are going to come in the form of mining.
Right.
private, and then developed market. A lot of those countries are dealing with their own internal, like the UK, for
Yeah.
example, BII needs certain credit ratings in
Yep,
Pakistan to invest. So you're seeing less. So you're seeing more like the 70s, where you're seeing the Gulf states kind of take a lead.
So last question. Of all the startups in play in Pakistan now, which one do you think is the unicorn?
So I'm biased, obviously.
I'm sure you are.
So I think we've got like probably Habal, Neape.
Right.
These are Neape is Danish. He's
Yeah.
built Cybernet,
Yeah.
Swarm Fiber. He's track record there, right? And
Yep.
so he's able to. I think those guys there. Adelphi has a potential as well as a credit scoring engine if it gets adopted in the region.
Right.
Postex is another one in my this is again, I'm just biased, so I'm talking about my portfolio. Bazaar, which is in my portfolio as well, has the potential as well. If the B2B interest reverts or they find a pivot
Right.
within this domain. But I think a bunch are going to get to look. So we have to be very satisfied with a bunch of companies exiting at 50 million, 100 million,
Yeah.
250 million.
We need to
right?
start the process. That's all.
That's going to happen. And that's
Exit.
starting, by the way. It's a lot of big techs have been snooping around
Yeah.
from both China and the US in Pakistan for strategic acquisitions. They're smart, so they buy when the market is
Right.
on the flip side.
Interesting. Faisal, this was very interesting, fascinating. I was very optimistic as well, which is great because it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity that we're sitting on.
Yes.
And issues will resolve themselves because the minute you give people the connectivity and the ability to transfer value, they'll find a way.
And it's going to happen whether we
And it sounds like
control
whether
it.
the state, in its current situation, whatever it does, this is inevitable. So that means the people here are actually set for an improvement in lifestyle because the technology is going to come regardless.
Absolutely.
I think we just have to hang in there.
we have to hang in there, have patience. It's
Have
a long
patience.
game.
Patience is the long game, exactly.
And then I'm not responsible for governance in this country, so that those powers that we have to figure that out.
Absolutely. Faisal, thank you so much for taking out the time. Really enjoyed the chat. I'll look forward to having you back again. And good luck with Shark Tank. You're a judge on a new show that's coming up. Best of luck for that. I think that
Super
also is
excited.
tied into some of what we're talking about and giving people the opportunity and the visibility.
Yes. And I think it's a confidence signal, right? Typically, Sony enters these markets that it thinks has potential. So let's see. I'm excited.
All right. Then thank you all for staying tuned to Digitales. Like, subscribe, and comment. I read your comments and I try to incorporate all the feedback. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.